She tried to evict a veteran from land he owns by burning down his barn. Her mistake? That barn had security cameras, and so did the chicken coop, and the mailbox, and the damn tomato patch. By the time she realized he owned the land under her entire HOA, it was too late. You don't start a war with a man who's already dug the trenches. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I spotted him, clipboard guy, tall, sunburned, wearing a wrinkled suit 2 sizes too big, standing right outside my front gate like he was about to serve me a subpoena. Behind him stood 2 others, a woman in a pink blouse and giant sunglasses that could double as satellite dishes, and another guy with a kind of smug face that made you want to check if your wallet was still in your pocket. The woman stepped forward first. "Final notice," she said, holding out a manila envelope like it was some sacred HOA scripture. "You have 7 days to vacate this property. Violations include unapproved fencing, non-standard barn paint, and non-permitted livestock density." I just blinked at her, still wearing sweatpants and holding a chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Marine." She finished with a flourish. "And unauthorized solar panels. That one's serious." I sipped slowly. "You folks do realize I'm not in your HOA, right?" The man in the suit, who hadn't even introduced himself, smirked. "You were annexed into Willow Glen Estates jurisdiction last month. It's in the bylaws." The woman chimed in again. Of course she did. "We expanded our coverage radius to include transitional perimeter properties." She said it like she was explaining a zoning code to a toddler. "You're in it now, sweetheart." Her tone made "sweetheart" sound like an insult with pearls on. I nodded, mostly to myself, as if this whole charade were mildly interesting. "Right, so let me get this straight," I said. "You expanded your imaginary empire and decided my ranch now falls under your suburban fiefdom?" No answer, just smug stares and note-taking. Clipboard guy was already scribbling something while glancing around like he was assessing a used car. They didn't know, and that was the funniest part. They had no idea that not only was I not part of their HOA, but that their precious clubhouse, the one with a flagpole, the conference room, and the tiny Zen garden, was actually sitting on land I owned, legally, fully deeded. I kept the paperwork in a fireproof safe next to my grandfather's medals and my dog's birth certificate. They didn't know, and I wasn't going to tell them. "Not yet. Appreciate the visit," I said casually. "I'll look into it." Then I turned and walked back inside, shutting the door behind me like I was closing a microwave. No slamming, no theatrics, just calm, controlled, veteran-grade, indifferent. From the kitchen window, I watched them linger for a few minutes, probably confused that I hadn't thrown a fit or threatened legal action. That's the thing about people like Karen. They're used to noise, rage, panic. They don't know what to do when you smile and walk away. Makes them twitchy. I watched as Karen pointed her sunglasses toward my barn, muttered something to clipboard guy, and then turned on her heel like she was strutting off a courtroom drama set. It would have been funny if it wasn't so pitiful. They were trying to evict a man from land he'd fought to buy, develop, and protect with his own 2 hands. Land that wasn't just home, but history. I poured another cup of coffee and leaned against the sink. Brutus, my black lab, wandered in and flopped down with a grunt that perfectly summed up the entire situation. I scratched his head. "We got company, buddy," I said. He didn't move, just let out a low whine like he'd already met Karen in a past life. I looked out the window again. They were gone now, probably off to measure someone's mailbox or enforce shrub symmetry. That's when I knew it wasn't just about them being wrong. It was about them being loud and wrong. And sooner or later, they were going to find out what it really meant to pick a fight with a man who owns the dirt beneath their throne. That morning, after the clipboard circus left, I sat down on the porch with Brutus and let the September sun burn off whatever leftover sleep I had in me. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't care. I wasn't thinking about bylaws or boundary lines. I was thinking about how far I'd come to get here. People like Karen saw a plot of land and assumed it was waiting to be managed. What they didn't see was the 20 years I spent overseas, moving equipment and personnel through places where bullets spoke louder than HOA codes. I didn't buy this land to impress anyone. I bought it because it was quiet, wide, and honest. 48 acres of clean Texas dirt, just outside Silver Creek. No neighbors for a half mile, no rules except the ones that made sense. The kind of place a man could breathe again. The first year out here felt like rehab from a life of noise. I rebuilt the old barn myself, one board at a time. I planted 24 trees along the fence line, raised a rescue horse named Jet, and installed a solar grid with my own damned hands. Nights were silent except for crickets and the occasional wind cutting across the hills. Nobody bothered me. Then came the developers. Big white trucks, billboards that said things like, "Where nature meets luxury." They cut down half the mesquite grove across the road and laid in paved cul-de-sacs like veins. Willow Glen estates sprang up faster than mold on bread. Cookie-cutter mansions with fake shutters and lawn signs about yoga groups. I watched it happen from my porch, sipping coffee like a man watching a fire that hadn't reached his house yet. At first, they left me alone. I wasn't part of their track. My property was never under their jurisdiction. I had my own well, my own road, and title maps that went back to 1949. But comfort breeds entitlement, and soon enough, the new residents started acting like they'd invented the town. The HOA sent me a letter suggesting I paint my barn a more community-friendly color. I framed it and hung it in the outhouse. Then they complained about my fencing not matching their perimeter guidelines, despite the fact that my fence had been here longer than their entire subdivision. When I didn't respond, Karen began showing up in person, always unannounced, always with that clipboard, like she thought paperwork had the power to exercise ranchers. I caught her once squinting at my vegetable garden like it was violating some kind of lettuce ordinance. The worst was the noise violation notice they sent after a neighborhood kid took riding lessons here and squealed too loud when Jet galloped for the first time. Karen actually wrote in bold ink that I should limit large animal activity to appropriate daylight hours as dictated by neighborhood rest standards. I nearly choked on my cornbread when I read it. That's when I realized this wasn't just HOA overreach. This was a campaign, a mission. Karen had declared war on my land, my lifestyle, and by extension, my existence. But she was playing checkers in a chess field. I'd been through real sieges, the kind that didn't come with clipboards or polo shirts, and I had patience, the kind trained into you after 2 decades of watching idiots get themselves blown up over bad intel. And still, I wasn't going to strike first. That's not who I am. But I did start keeping records. Every letter, every visit, every passive-aggressive flyer stuffed in my mailbox. I upgraded my cameras, moved the DVR into a steel lockbox, and set up cloud backup just in case someone got bold. And that's when I noticed something strange one night. A white SUV parked at the edge of my field, engine off, lights out, just sitting there. For over 20 minutes, Karen thought she was hunting violations. What she didn't know was that she'd wandered into a minefield. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because some battles, you don't win by shouting. You win by letting your enemy walk deeper into your trap. The next morning, I reviewed the security footage again. Sure enough, there it was. Same white SUV from the night before, parked just beyond the north fence, half hidden behind a grove of pecan trees. Zooming in, I could make out the license plate. And right there behind the windshield was that ridiculous pink sun visor Karen always used, the one that made her look like she was preparing for a solar eclipse at a golf tournament. She hadn't just wandered onto my land before, she was now casing it. I saved the clip, filed it under a folder I'd labeled Karen Shenanigans, and went about my day like nothing had happened. But inside, I'd flipped a switch. It was one thing to be bossy. It was another to start lurking around my ranch like a raccoon with a clipboard. That week, things escalated like a bad sitcom. First came the letter accusing me of violating communal life standards because my barn light was too aggressively luminescent. Then a printed flyer appeared, zip-tied to my gate, warning residents about potential non-compliant livestock behavior, accompanied by a blurry photo of Jet yawning. Not running, not kicking, just young. My favorite, though, was when Karen marched up to my gate, leaned over like she owned the place, and yelled, "Your rooster is disrupting morning meditation hours." I didn't even have a rooster. But at that point, I was convinced she'd blame a leaf for falling too loud. I stayed calm, dead quiet, because every crazy thing she did, I captured. And the longer she played HOA dictator, the deeper she walked into the quicksand. Then one afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange tag zip-tied to my mailbox. It read, "Unsafe structure, subject to immediate review by community oversight." My mailbox, not the barn, not the solar panels, the damn mailbox. I stared at it for a good 30 seconds, not even angry, just impressed at how far gone these people were. Karen wasn't enforcing order, she was staging a siege with stationery. I peeled the tag off, took a picture, and added it to the growing file. I thought, she's running out of things to harass. Next, she'll say my grass is growing at a rebellious angle. Then again, knowing Karen, that was probably already on next week's agenda. But she wasn't working alone. One night, I caught someone walking the perimeter of my fence. Medium build, wearing a reflective vest, clipboard in hand. At 10:45 p.m., who the hell conducts HOA inspections in the dark? I stayed inside, watching through my cameras, and when he reached the gate, he snapped a few photos and walked off into the trees. That's when I realized this was bigger than Karen's ego. This was coordinated, some kind of weird suburban surveillance game disguised as community protection. And I wasn't just the neighbor who didn't comply, I was the enemy. I didn't know what they were planning next, but I had a hunch it wouldn't involve another politely worded letter. So I stopped playing defense. I printed my property survey and stapled it to the inside of my gate, highlighted, notarized, labeled with the phrase, not part of Willow Glen Estates, not subject to HOA regulations. Then I mounted 2 new floodlights, repositioned the trail cameras, and left a trail of fresh boot prints near the barn just to remind them someone was always home. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, because Karen's little HOA fantasy was about to hit a very real wall. And deep down, I could feel it. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 2 days after I posted the survey map on my gate, I found a flyer duct taped over it. In bold red letters, it read, "Unauthorized signage may result in fines." No signature, no seal, just a scare tactic written in cheap ink and arrogance. I peeled it off slowly, folded it 4 times, and slid it into my file folder right between the rooster complaint and the mailbox violation. By then, the Karen archive had grown thicker than my VA medical file. That afternoon, while stacking hay bales in the barn, I kept thinking about how this all started with a few letters and sideways glances. But now, it felt like a Cold War. Flyers, tags, midnight photo ops. And the worst part, they still had no idea they were playing this whole game on my field. Years ago, before Willow Glen even broke ground, I bought the extra 6 acres west of my main lot. Back then, it was just brush and red clay. Ugly to anyone with a real estate license, but perfect for me. I'd planned to build riding trails through it or maybe a second corral. Never got around to it. Then the developers came in with their glossy brochures and shiny shoes and poured a parking lot right over the edge of that land. And smack in the middle, they built their pride and joy. The Willow Glen Community Center. Flagpole, LED-lit fountain, HOA office, yoga room with bamboo floors, the whole suburban spaceship. I didn't say a word. Let them build. Let them host meetings, elect tyrants, print newsletters. I even waved once at a guy installing motion lights over the boardroom door. Because the truth is, sometimes revenge doesn't need to be loud. It just needs time. The land deed sat untouched in my safe for years, surveyed, signed, and filed before their contractors ever stepped foot on it. Their title company missed it. The developer assumed it had been bundled into a previous lot sale. They were wrong. I was the rightful owner of the dirt beneath their headquarters, and I kept the receipts, literally. But I never flaunted it. I just watched, waited, because I knew someday someone like Karen would come along, someone who thought rules were hers to write and neighbors were hers to command. Then when that day came, I wanted every piece in place. Now, watching them spiral deeper into delusion, I realized we were almost there. The final nudge came when I received a certified letter, delivered, ironically, to the very mailbox they claimed was unsafe. It was a formal notice of noncompliance. Karen had escalated to full HOA enforcement mode. They were initiating removal proceedings due to repeated refusals to bring property in line with community aesthetics. I laughed so hard, Brutus barked. The phrase removal proceedings sounded like I was a limb they were cutting off a tree. That evening, I sat down, poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, and opened the safe. The envelope hadn't been touched in years, but the paper inside was crisp, every signature sharp. Original deed, aerial photos, survey stamps, legal descriptions that laid out every inch of that land and exactly where their little empire had trespassed. But I wasn't going to file anything just yet. No, not yet. I had something better in mind. Because there's a special kind of silence that comes before the storm, and I could feel it brewing, thick, electric. The kind of silence that only lasts until someone makes the mistake of thinking they've already won. And Karen, she was about to make that mistake loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. The storm came sooner than I thought, literally and figuratively. 2 nights after I reviewed the deed and stacked it neatly on my desk, a thunderhead rolled in over Silver Creek, dragging wind and heat lightning through the valley like some angry ghost. I sat on the porch with Brutus at my feet, listening to the rumble and sipping coffee, when my phone buzzed. Motion detected, gate camera. I tapped into the feed, and there she was, bathed in night vision green, Karen, standing just outside the fence in her HOA president uniform, capris, heels, clipboard. Behind her were 2 men. One of them carried a bolt cutter like he was posing for a hardware store ad gone rogue. They didn't knock. They didn't hesitate. They clipped the lock clean and walked in like they were repossessing a rental car. I stayed seated for exactly 3 seconds. Then I was up, boots on, phone dialing the sheriff while the security app played live in my other hand. Brutus growled low, ears pinned. "Stay," I muttered, already moving. By the time I crossed the yard, Karen and her entourage were halfway to my barn, flashlights dancing across the gravel. "Mark," she called out, smiling like a televangelist caught trespassing, "we're conducting a surprise site visit. You failed to respond to our latest notice." I stopped 5 feet from her, holding up my phone so the dispatcher could hear. "They broke the lock. They're on my land, and I have video," I said calmly. The woman on the line, Deputy Harris, replied without missing a beat. "We're en route. Stay with them, but do not engage physically." Karen, overhearing that, laughed. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "This is community enforcement." Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. By the time 2 patrol cars pulled up, her confidence had cracked like an old tile. Gary and the red-headed bolt cutter guy tried to disappear into the shadows, but was quickly found standing awkwardly near the compost bin. IDs were collected, stories clashed, and the deputies didn't need long. Harris turned to Karen and said with professional flatness, "This property is not within your jurisdiction. You're trespassing, and based on this footage, you're also guilty of breaking and entering." That word guilty hung in the air like fresh gunpowder. Karen stammered, then shifted blame to Gary, who just muttered, "I was told we had authority. They were issued citations, photographed, and warned. Return again, and they'd be arrested." Karen didn't argue. She just marched back to her SUV, heels sinking into the gravel, mascara streaking from the humidity and her own rage. I thought that would be it, the peak. But I was wrong. 3 nights later, I woke at 2:16 a.m.ing to the smell of smoke. Faint but unmistakable. Brutus was already up, whining, pawing at the door. I grabbed the flashlight, sprinted to the barn, and found flames licking the sidewall of the hay storage. Someone had tossed a lit flare through a side gap. I managed to smother it before it spread, but the charred corner and the blackened grass told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a message. The sheriff came fast, took the flare casing, reviewed the footage, which showed a masked figure slipping through the trees with a gas can, but the face was hidden. Deputy Harris clenched his jaw. "This was no accident," he said. "This was meant to scare you, maybe worse." I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch, shotgun across my lap, floodlights illuminating every inch of the yard, heart thudding like I was back on base. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was cold, focused, because now it wasn't just HOA drama or Karen's power trip. It was criminal. And that meant it was time to move the game off the front yard and into the courtroom. But before I could even reach for the legal hammer, something far more dangerous arrived, a warning, hand-delivered and soaked in threat. Taped to my gate the next morning was a single photo, a shot of my ranch from inside the HOA Clubhouse taken through their tinted glass window and scribbled on the back in red ink like blood from a cheap pen. "Next time, it won't be just hay that burns." I held that photo in my hands for a long time, longer than I probably should have. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, but deliberate. The angle of the picture told me whoever took it had spent time inside the HOA Clubhouse. Likely someone with access, someone who'd stood behind that glass and watched my land like a hunter watch a target. I flipped it back and forth, committing every detail to memory, then slid it into a plastic sleeve and filed it under a new label. Threats. After that, I didn't talk. I acted. I called my lawyer, Eleanor Grant, and drove straight to her office with the photo, the flare casing, and a thumb drive packed with footage from every camera I had. She looked through everything in silence, then set her glasses down like she was about to brief a general. "This is arson," she said. "It's criminal intimidation. If it connects back to the HOA or one of its board members, it becomes conspiracy. We'll bury them." That night, I didn't go home right away. I sat in my truck outside the Silver Creek Sheriff's Department, replaying every moment from the past 2 weeks like a war map. I knew the who, Karen. I just didn't have the how, not yet. But the picture proved one thing. Someone from inside that clubhouse wanted me scared, quiet, or gone, probably all three. And they were getting sloppy. The camera angle was so specific, so avoidable, it reeked of ego, like they wanted me to know they were watching. That's what power does to people like Karen. It makes them bold. It makes them careless. And just when I thought things couldn't get bolder, fate dropped me a wild card in cowboy boots. His name was Greg Palmer. He knocked on my door 2 days later, just before sunset, holding a binder so thick it looked like it could stop a bullet. Greg was a retired land surveyor, lived 2 streets over, had the kind of sun leather skin that said he'd spent most of his life outdoors and didn't care much for HOA decorative shrub policies. I invited him in. He opened the binder on my kitchen table and said, "I got your letter, and I've got something you need to see." Inside were land plats, dated years before Willow Glen was even proposed. "Your land," he said, tapping a thick finger on the map, "was never ceded. The developer didn't file an easement. They just assumed you were part of the plan." I leaned in. "And you told them?" "Tried," he muttered. "They ignored me. Said I was too old-fashioned to understand modern zoning. So I watched, and when I saw what they did to you, hell, I had to say something." He had more copies of emails, early HOA drafts, even a hand-sketched map Karen once used in a town meeting where my land had been penciled in like it belonged to them. It didn't. None of it did. Then came the real bombshell, a leaked email from Karen herself to a board member named Fletcher. Subject line, "Removing the obstacle." In it, she wrote, "If we can't get Matthews out legally, we apply other pressure. Gary's already looking into options. No mess." I stared at the printout for a long time. That was it. The chain, the threat, the flare, the photo, all connected. I looked at Greg. "Why now?" He exhaled. "Because I used to believe in HOAs. Thought they kept neighborhoods clean, but Karen twisted it into a weapon. You didn't deserve this." I nodded slowly, my brain shifting into gear. The flare, the trespassing, the surveillance. Now I had motive, means, and a witness. Karen thought she was untouchable behind her blinds and blinds, but she forgot something crucial. Veterans don't run, we fortify. That night I emailed everything to Eleanor, photos, documents, Greg's statement, and by morning she had drafted a new version of our lawsuit. This one included civil damages, criminal conspiracy, zoning fraud, and a petition for immediate injunction against HOA activity on my land. But before we could serve it, fate decided to strike first, and this time, not with ink or fire, but lightning. Because that very night, a real storm rolled in over Silver Creek, and when it left, so did the roof of the HOA headquarters. The storm came in angry, no warning, just a sky split wide open with thunder and rain so thick it felt biblical. I remember standing at the window watching the trees bend like they were begging when the lightning hit. A jagged bolt cracked through the dark and struck an old oak behind the HOA clubhouse, sent sparks flying like shrapnel. The power across half the neighborhood blinked out in an instant. 10 minutes later, I heard sirens. I didn't rush outside. I already knew when you spend enough time under real fire, you learn the rhythm of chaos. And this wasn't nature throwing a tantrum. This felt calculated, confirmed just hours later when Deputy Harris knocked on my door, soaked and serious. "We found signs of accelerant," he said. "Power to the building was cut manually. Someone wanted that place to burn." By morning, the community center was a blackened shell. Water pooled where laminate floors used to be. Burnt papers floated across the sidewalk like confetti from a funeral. Neighbors gathered in bathrobes and slippers, whispering, gawking. And right in the middle of it all stood Karen, soaked, red-eyed, pointing a trembling finger across the parking lot. "He did this," she screamed. "Mark Matthews burned down our community center." Cameras from 3 local stations pivoted toward me, and I didn't even flinch. I stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, wearing the same flannel shirt I'd had on since 5 a.m. and said nothing, because I didn't have to. Deputy Harris stepped between us and said firmly, "We're not making accusations without evidence, Miss Whitmore." Karen snapped back, He threatened us. He had motive. I just tilted my head, checked my security feed. I didn't leave the house. Also, asked her what she was doing standing by my tree line 3 nights ago. I've got that footage too. Her face went pale, then flushed, then she turned and stormed off. Again, same pattern, same playbook. She couldn't control me, so she tried to erase me. But now, her plans were burning in more ways than one. That afternoon, I turned over the footage every second from my porch cam from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. Crystal clear. I was on the porch, cleaning tools, drinking tea. Brutus snoring by my feet. No suspicious movement, no contact with the clubhouse. Meanwhile, investigators confirmed it wasn't an accident. Multiple ignition points, accelerant residue inside the walls, no signs of forced entry, but someone used a key. That narrowed the list to 5 people, and Karen's name was on top. Then came the kicker. 3 days after the fire, the HOA's insurance claim was denied. The provider pulled the property deed, realized the land the clubhouse sat on wasn't legally theirs, and pulled the plug. No payout, no rebuild, nothing. I got the call from Eleanor while feeding the chickens. They finally checked the title, she said, practically laughing. They've been squatting on your land for years, Mark. Now it's a total loss, and nobody's going to bail them out. I nearly dropped the feed bucket. It was too perfect. Karen had built her kingdom on a lie, and now it was ash, uninsured, and technically mine. But the story didn't end there. That evening, Eleanor called again. Her voice no longer mused, but tense. "You need to come to the office," she said. "We just got a packet from a whistleblower. Inside a man envelope were email screenshots, board meeting notes, and one message that froze my blood. From Karen to the entire HOA board. Subject: removing the obstacle. If we can't push him out legally," it read, "maybe it's time we make him want to leave another way. Gary has connections, quiet ones." Attached was a copy of a wire transfer, 4 digits. HOA slush account, recipient, Gary R. Mannix. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a conspiracy. And I suddenly knew I hadn't been paranoid at all. I'd been hunted. I left Eleanor's office with the envelope clutched so tight in my hand it crinkled like dried leaves. It wasn't just evidence. It was confirmation. Everything I'd suspected, everything I'd lived through these past few months was real. Written in black and white emails from a woman who signed HOA notices with a flourish like she was signing autographs. Karen hadn't just bent the rules. She had broken laws. Multiple. And now, with the wire transfer to Gary exposed, we had the receipts to prove. That night, I didn't go home. I went straight to the sheriff's department, dropped the packet on Deputy Harris's desk, and said, "You wanted motive, method, and money? Here's all 3. He called in a county investigator before I finished the sentence. By morning, the sheriff's office had launched an official criminal investigation. Charges under review: arson, criminal conspiracy, harassment, property damage, and if the flare had done more than scorch my barn, attempted endangerment. I'd barely finished installing a new motion sensor by the chicken coop when Harris called back. "Mark," he said, voice tight, "we're filing a subpoena for HOA financial records and server emails. You need to keep your head down. Karen's cornered, and cornered people do stupid things." I told him not to worry. I wasn't alone anymore. That same afternoon, I made a few phone calls to old friends, retired Marines, former logistics guys from my unit. Within 48 hours, 4 of them were parked in my guest rooms, rotating shifts like it was Fallujah in July. We weren't armed for battle, but we were watching, recording, waiting, and that was enough. Still, the threat came. At exactly 2:42 a.m., 3 nights after the investigation started, one of the perimeter cameras pinged north fence line, movement, Brutus's feed, linked from my brother's ranch, lit up with barking. My phone flashed live footage, a figure crawling through the brush, low, fast, carrying something heavy. I radioed Wyatt, one of my old unit buddies. "Visual confirmed," he whispered back. "Male adult heading toward the generator shack, carrying a jerry can." I replied without hesitation, "Do not engage, record only." We followed the guy silently, camera feeds rolling, until he reached the shack, opened the fuel cap, and froze. A red laser dot had landed right on his chest. "Hands up," I called out, stepping from the shadows. He turned, bolted, and ran straight into a wire snare we'd set for coyotes. His legs went out from under him, body hit the dirt hard, and the can spilled beside him. Gasoline, fresh. Intent was clear. The patrol cars came quick. When they cuffed him and pulled off the ski mask, it was Gary, sunburned, twitchy, same guy who'd cut my lock weeks before. He didn't say a word, didn't have to. Between the jerry can, the footage, and the wire transfer, the puzzle was complete. The next morning, the sheriff's office issued a warrant for Karen Whitmore, but she was already gone. Packed her bags and fled town before they knocked. That would have been the end if she hadn't mailed one last middle finger on her way out. A full-page article in the Silver Creek Gazette titled, "Veteran Rancher Poses Threat to HOA Safety." Photos of her in a neck brace, weeping in her lawyer's office, claiming I'd waged a hate campaign against a civil volunteer. It was laughable, until it wasn't. Some neighbors started pulling away. One canceled a writing lesson. Another stopped waving. It stung more than I expected. I'd spent years building this land, this life, but now I was the villain in someone else's narrative. I didn't strike back. I went smart. Greg called in a favor from his niece, Savannah, a local reporter with a YouTube channel. We sat down at the barn. One mic, one camera, one story. I told everything: the trespassing, the flare, the clubhouse, the land, the trap. The video was called "The HOA Tried to Evict a Veteran Rancher." Then he dropped the deed. In 48 hours, it hit 2.8 million views. And just like that, the tide turned. Karen was tracked down at a hotel in Corpus Christi 2 weeks later, arrested without incident. The image of her in cuffs and a designer sweatsuit went viral on the neighborhood Facebook page with the caption, "HOA Queen gets HOA arrested." A month later, she stood trial. The jury took 3 days. Guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 6 months in county jail, 4 years probation, and permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state of Texas. The board resigned in shame. Willow Glen HOA was officially dissolved. At the first neighborhood town hall, they invited me to speak. I wore my cleanest flannel, stood up and said, "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to offer something better." I donated the land where their clubhouse once stood to a veterans nonprofit. We built a riding arena for kids with disabilities, a community garden, and a space that belonged to everyone. No fees, no fines, no clipboards. Lisa brought cupcakes. Greg was elected treasurer. Even Karen's silent husband showed up and shook my hand. After the meeting, I walked home with Brutus at my side, the stars above us, and for the first time in months, no motion alerts, just wind and peace. That photo, the one Karen left with a threat, I kept it, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Some people scream to feel powerful, but real power is quiet. It's owning your truth, holding your ground, and knowing, sometimes literally, that the land they're standing on is yours. They tried to push me out with flyers, threats, and fires. But what they didn't understand is this: real strength doesn't come from bylaws or board meetings. It comes from knowing who you are and standing firm when someone tries to erase you. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight dirty. I just let the facts, the law, and the land do the talking. In the end, they lost their clubhouse, their power, and their pride, all because they underestimated a man who simply refused to be bullied. If you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare or a Karen who thinks she runs your life, remember this: truth is louder than gossip, patience is stronger than ego, and sometimes karma wears cowboy boots. Drop a comment, share your story, and hit like if you've ever had to deal with a clipboard tyrant. Let's make sure the next Karen thinks twice before trespassing on the wrong patch of land.